Tonight, getting the ball rolling on the budget. What funding priorities in the Texas House made the first cut? Plus, fossil fuels or renewable energy.
These bills are just going to increase costs enormously on Texas consumers.
The lieutenant governor makes clear what direction he favors. Plus, an unprecedented hearing.
The attorneys had to admit that this has never been done before.
How one Texas judge could totally change the way people get abortions in this country. Capitol Tonight starts right now. Hello and thanks for joining us here on Capitol Tonight. I am Rena Diamante in for Karina Kling. Facing an unprecedented surplus of $33 billion, the Texas House's budget writers gave initial approval to the state's spending blueprint. The House Appropriation Committee's budget includes $17 billion in school property tax cuts, as well as a 2-year freeze on state college tuition. Other provisions include spending more than $343 million on air conditioners for state prisoners and the first cost of living adjustment for retired teachers in nearly 20 years. The committee also voted to keep a proposal to cut state funding for diversity, equity, and inclusion programs at state colleges, but not without contention. Democrats pushed back against it, but Republicans expressed concerns about the content of such initiatives. We expect the bill to reach the House floor for debate in April. Joining us now for our reporter roundtable this week is Bob Garrett, Austin Bureau Chief of the Dallas Morning News, and Jasper Scherer, state politics reporter for the Houston Chronicle. Thank you both so much for your time. Bob, in your article about House Appropriations giving tentative approval for its budget, you pointed out it wasn't totally harmonious in the end when Democrats tried to stop a provision to cut off funds for diversity programs at state colleges. How do you see the budget progressing through the House?
Well, it's going to be on the House floor Holy Week right before Easter, and it's usually an almost all-night affair, Rena, and the legislators attach all sorts of different topics, just like this DEI thing, to the budget and see if they can get it on there. Oftentimes those are symbolic, sometimes they're meaningful, but it's the one bill that the legislature has to pass is the budget, so everyone wants to load it up with their own amendments.
Jasper, we haven't seen the Senate budget passed out of committee yet, but where do you see big differences between the two chambers, particularly when it comes to property tax relief?
Yeah, I think the property tax relief part of it is one of the biggest remaining differences, one of the biggest items really that we don't know how it's going to end up by the time the session's over with. Both chambers agree that the state should spend billions of dollars of its massive budget surplus on, providing some sort of relief, but we still have this pretty big divide between the House proposal that is taking an approach centered around appraisal caps, lowering the appraisal cap for homes, but also extending that out to all types of property, including businesses. The Senate is taking an approach focused on raising the homestead exemption for school property taxes. So we'll just have to see how, it's possible there could be some sort of approach that includes, both or some sort of combination, but there's still a pretty big divide at this point.
Bob, you've also written about the differences in the must-pass bills of Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick and House Speaker Dade Phelan. What are some of those major differences? And in the end, do you think both will get what they want?
Well, some of the major differences, Rena, are that the House and Phelan have things business wants, like a replacement for tax abatements called Chapter 313 that were stalled last session, and a reform of community colleges funding to make sure they produce more skilled workers that are available for jobs. The Senate, Dan Patrick wants school choice or vouchers. He wants electric grid stuff. Then he has a whole host of culture war issues that he wants. The House, though, did a very interesting thing. They got to the right of the Senate with a border security bill that would create a new border protection unit, enlist citizen volunteers to help enforce the state's effort to secure the border. Very controversial bill, but one that might distract or give House Republicans a chance to brag that they did something very conservative.
And Jasper, you've written recently about one of Speaker Phelan's priorities, which requires tech companies to get parental consent before collecting their kids' data. How does this represent a greater political trend across the country?
Yeah, a lot of states, both conservative and liberal, are taking up similar measures. California, Utah have both passed similar bills. California kind of kicked off this trend, and it's a politically popular kind of notion to rein in these big tech companies and try to limit the effect that they're having on especially the mental health of teenagers who kind of get sucked into these apps. So, a lot of details to iron out in the bill still. I think critics, both tech companies and, maybe some Democrats are making the case that, the way it's constructed now is just so broad, it would apply to just about every website on the internet. And it's going to be really tough to enforce what they're trying to do, but it'd be fascinating to see how that plays out.
Bob, will the bills the Texas legislature pass in the end create a glide path for Governor Abbott to run for president in 2024?
Well, Rena, they certainly will pass bills that Greg Abbott, if he wants to run for president, can claim. He's very much pushing for the school choice education savings accounts to take kids if their parents could go to private schools with this state money. I don't know if he can get that passed, but that would be something he could crow about if it did get passed. And so I think we'll just have to see. There's a lot of division of opinion over whether Abbott is really seriously looking at the White House or enjoys having his name mentioned. But the clock is ticking, and if he does get in, he'll be doing what Rick Perry did in 2011, which is getting in relatively late and have to organize very quickly.
Bob Garrett and Jasper Scherer, thank you both so much for your time. I appreciate it. Let's get a check of some other political stories making headlines. The state Senate this week approved a measure to help pay down debt from the 2021 winter storm. The state would give around $3.8 billion to 8 Texas gas utilities. That money would pay back consumers who paid high energy bills because of the storm. Meanwhile, Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee is asking the White House to intervene and stop the state's takeover of Houston ISD. She's asking President Joe Biden and the Department of Education to investigate the takeovers of schools throughout the state receiving federal funding. She called the takeovers systemic and discriminatory. And a resolution in the Texas House to recognize a prominent gay couple was pulled by its author after it received backlash. Representative Mihaela Plisa told the Dallas Morning News the resolution was targeted by some of the conservative House members and that she would submit a different resolution to honor the couple that doesn't require a vote by the full House. The resolution would honor Mark Ferris and Victor Holmes, who sued to overturn Texas's ban on same-sex marriage. A federal judge in Amarillo will soon decide on a case that will affect access to medication abortion nationwide, even in states where the procedure is legal. Judge Matthew Kazmarek is weighing whether to uphold the Food and Drug Administration's approval of a medication used in more than half of abortions in the U.S. Mifepristone is the first of 2 pills used in medication abortions. It's been on the market for more than 20 years, but a group of abortion rights opponents filed a lawsuit saying the FDA misused its authority when it approved the drug back in 2000. For more on this, Augustine Garcia spoke with Seema Mohapatra. She's a health law professor with Southern Methodist University. Here's her take on whether the U.S. took the right steps to approve the abortion medication.
They followed all the protocols. It's been over 2 decades since it's been approved. And although that they went through an accelerated pathway, that actually, was a full review that was done. And the safety record of the drug has proven to be much safer than aspirin and, other drugs that are easily available in the drugstore.
How unprecedented is it for certain groups to challenge the FDA's approval of certain drugs?
It's extremely unprecedented. It showed that the attorneys had to admit that this has never been done before, and especially after 20 some years, questioning the approval of a very safe and effective drug.
Judges make big decisions all the time, but how significant is this one for one judge to possibly make this decision that's going to affect the entire country?
It would be unprecedented. I mean, just the fact that one judge sitting in court in Texas could affect the way that access to health care is available throughout the country, regardless of what the state legislatures think, is unprecedented for sure.
Turning back to the proper steps to approve drugs like mifepristone, is there a review process every so few years, I should say, like every 5 or every 10? Or we know that this has been approved for a long time.
Yes, I mean, the safety record of mifepristone for, as I mentioned, is kind of extremely safe, extremely effective. And so, this lawsuit, if it ends up having a FDA approved drug taken off the market, is going to have huge public health consequences because a lot of other drugs that are available might be at risk, and that's going to affect the way that healthcare is administered throughout the United States. And so we have something called federal preemption, where the FDA approval should preempt any kind of state laws. That is what should be, at issue here. However, it is not clear, given the court that it's in and the lawsuit, how the judge is actually going to rule.
If the judge does strike down the FDA's approval, what are the next steps that we're looking at here?
Well, we'll for sure get an appeal kind of immediately, for sure, and probably a request for a stay while the appeal is being heard. That's what probably the immediate steps are going to be. But there is going to be a question about how this is going to impact access to this medication, how the manufacturer is going to react. And we know that there is a one drug regimen that is available. However, it is not as efficacious for the patients as the 2-drug regimen that includes mifepristone.
Still to come on Capitol tonight's prioritizing power plants, how some state lawmakers are pushing to keep fossil fuels the main source of Texas energy, and why one energy expert says expanding natural gas won't save Texans any money. Welcome back. Some Republican lawmakers in the state Senate want to incentivize building more power plants in Texas. They say they're aiming to increase the grid's reliability. It's a top priority for Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick this legislative session. And as Charlotte Scott reports, the Senate is focused on fossil fuels over renewables.
2 years ago, hundreds of Texans died when the grid failed during a winter storm. In an effort to make sure this never happens again, the Texas Senate is trying to incentivize companies to build more fossil fuel power plants. They say that'll make the grid more reliable during future extreme weather events. Although a bill passed during the last legislative session to help weatherize the grid, Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick says there's still more to be done.
And we're going to have dispatchable that guarantees, in the worst weather conditions, that when you hit that light switch, the lights come on.
Energy expert Ed Hers says it's long overdue for Texas to invest in the grid.
The leadership realizes they have a real problem. There's been underinvestment in the Texas grid for more than 20 years, and they need to find a way to encourage new participants to join the grid, new transmission lines to be built.
But the legislation filed by these senators would reduce support for renewable energy, like solar and wind.
We have invested heavily in renewables, but now it's time to focus on dispatchable.
The Senate is finding ways to compensate power plant owners so they can build new facilities and have a guaranteed rate of return. And as Texas grows, Hers says more generation is needed to keep up with demand. He adds that business owners can still invest in solar and wind. It's just not something Texas lawmakers are focused on right now.
We lead the nation. We're #1 in wind. But what these bills that are increasing costs on renewables is saying we're going to retreat from that leadership position.
That was Colin Layden with the Environmental Defense Fund. He says Texas doesn't necessarily need to incentivize more renewables to come here because people are already doing that on their own. But instead of giving more money to fossil fuel plants, he says the legislature should instead pay Texans to make their homes more energy efficient so less power of any kind is needed.
Sealing around windows, spending money on insulation, upgrading HVACs, all those sorts of things. And we do not invest enough in Texas in fixing those things. And that will bring demand down.
Even if there's disagreement on how best to invest Texas's money, most lawmakers agree something needs to be done now so Texans are never left in the dark again.
It's going to take 2 to 3 years. That's why we have to start now. We can't wait another session to do that.
For Capital Tonight, I'm Charlotte Scott.
Earlier this week, Augustine Garcia spoke with Doug Lewin. He's an energy expert and president of Stoic Energy. Here's his take on some lawmakers' approach to investing more into natural gas.
This is a very expensive option. I had tweeted the other day that it's about $11 billion, and I had a few people DM me saying you're undercounting it because you've got operations and maintenance, and you've got fuel costs and all these kinds of other things that are going to go into this. So we call it at least $11 or $12 billion, and the objective can't just be reliability. It has to be reliability for a grid that people can actually afford to keep their lights and their heating and air conditioning on. And this doesn't achieve that. The legislature put $6 billion onto customers' bills last time, another $10, $11, $12 billion going on this time. At a certain point, people's ability to pay just breaks down.
With the creation or building of these new power plants, how will Texans save money if these bills become law?
They won't. I mean, it's just an absurd claim on its face. There's no way that you could put, again, somewhere around $12 billion onto customers' bills and claim that actually saves them money. It just doesn't. It's just an extra cost. And I don't know how else to explain it than just to say, use your own rationality. If somebody tells you they're going to add 12, look, ERCOT, the entire amount of money that moves through the ERCOT market in a year is about $20 to $25 billion. So if you add $10 or $12 billion, you're adding a huge amount of cost onto people's bills.
Well, as we heard in Charlotte's story, there's been some pushback on renewable energy from some Texas leaders. Is this the right move from lawmakers?
It's definitely not. Look, renewables are challenging from a grid integration perspective. The goal has to be to integrate as much renewable energy as you possibly can because that is zero fuel cost energy. And what we're just talking about with energy bills, you have different ways you can go. You can add a lot of cost or you can try to reduce it. I think the goal of the legislature should be to try to reduce that cost. We know from different surveys that between 30 to 45% of Texas families choose between food, medicine, and energy at some point during the last year. So renewables, we have a study from a UT energy researcher that shows about $1 billion a month in savings to the market from renewables. We need to figure out how to integrate more in order to drive bills lower.
Do you think these incentives to create more power plants should instead be put towards renewables?
Well, I think where they should really be put towards, what we really should focus on is what is often called in the industry distributed energy resources. These are local sources of power on the roofs and in the garages in the form of batteries, in the form of energy efficiency for homes and buildings. These distributed energy resources that build resilience not only for when we don't have enough supply to meet demand like in February 2021, but also during things like hurricanes or ice storms like Austin experienced earlier this year. If you have those distributed resources, you have resiliency for all kinds of different outages.
We have about 30 seconds. Any other actions you think lawmakers should take when it comes to Texas energy?
Well, I mentioned it just a minute ago. I think energy efficiency is one of the absolutely key things we need to do, right? You have two sides of the coin, supply and demand. Legislators seem very exclusively focused on supply and adding supply, but you could actually reduce demand, and that also makes the grid more reliable, but lowers people's bills and returns value to customers.
Still ahead on Capitol Tonight's breaking 6 weeks of silence. President Joe Biden and U.S. House Speaker Kevin McCarthy come face to face once again after debate over the debt limit. A rare moment of unity on Capitol Hill Friday as President Joe Biden and House Speaker Kevin McCarthy attend the same St. Patrick's Day celebration. And in the spirit of the holiday, the House Speaker managed to joke about one of the biggest issues standing between them. Spectrum News' Washington correspondent Reuben Jones was there.
Well, Speaker Kevin McCarthy never said the exact words in front of President Joe Biden on Friday, but everyone knew what he was talking about. The federal government just months away from hitting its borrowing limit. The two leaders disagree over what to do. The president says the debt ceiling should be raised with no strings attached, while McCarthy says there should be cuts with any additional borrowing. Now, McCarthy spoke here at the Capitol in a lunch with Leo Varadkar, the Irish Prime Minister, or Taoiseach.
Because for America, we know the stakes are high. That a clash is brewing, people say, between the president and I. Of what should we do? Of what would be the ramifications for the entire nation in the coming months? And I think you might be able to settle this for us. Which one of us is more Irish?
They may not have found an agreement on who bleeds green more or a way to avoid the U.S. hitting its debt ceiling, but they were able to unite around the spirit of St. Patrick's Day. McCarthy, Biden, and Varadkar bonded over a meal and some traditional Irish music. The Irish leader presented Biden with a bowl of shamrocks earlier in the day, continuing a tradition that began in 1952. As part of his visit, the White House dyed the South Lawn fountain green. McCarthy and Biden embraced the chance for unity during their remarks Friday.
Well, I agree with the Speaker. There's no reason why we can't find common ground. There's no reason why we can't hope to change this direction of the extremism both our parties are pushing. I think it's important.
Biden has said he plans to visit the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland to mark the 25th anniversary of the signing of the U.S.-brokered Good Friday Accord, which helped end decades of violence over Great Britain ruling Northern Ireland. In Washington, Reuben Jones, Capitol Tonight.
The parent company of Silicon Valley Bank is now filing for bankruptcy protection about a week after the bank was seized by the government. SVB Financial Group, along with the company's CEO and chief financial officer, are facing a class action lawsuit. They're being accused of not disclosing the risks that future interest rate increases would have on its business. The financial company is no longer affiliated with Silicon Valley Bank. And that is going to do it for this edition of Capitol Tonight. Join us Monday for the latest in Texas politics. Until then, thank you for watching and have a great evening.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. For more refreshing stories about your community, click the subscribe button over here. You can also download our Spectrum News app and tune in to Channel 55 on Dish and DirecTV to get live news coverage, weather updates every 10 minutes, and more. We'll see you then.